Hi, Misha here, and in some ways this is a part 4, in other ways it's a standalone video. In parts 1, 2, and 3 we talked about Apollo, from the rocket to the CSM to the time on the moon. And we kind of left off here looking at the suited figures from the Space Voyagers Action Products series, amongst others. But today we're going to talk about the kind of evolution of the spacesuit in the USA. And these are more from Action Products. They have actually made a number of scales and types of figure. These, much like the ones we looked at before, are kind of 1/18 scale, so roughly 4 inch. They're actually slightly taller. So G.I. Joe size-ish. But these are more like 1/14 scale, 5 inch and some change. So slightly smaller than, say, a Black Series. They don't move, they're just kind of statues. These have some basic articulation. But it's a good example piece of, just all the suits. So we kind of start off with the Mercury spacesuit, which was a highly modified U.S. Navy Mark IV high-altitude pressure suit. Then we move into the G4C, which was the first Gemini suit, and that evolved into the G4C for EVAs, and the G5C, which was a specialized version. And those actually evolved into the first suit meant for Apollo, the A1C, but after the Apollo 1 accident, that was very much revised into the prototype A5L and the actual production A7L, which itself had a number of variants. That was the main moon suit, and it would continue on all the way through Skylab and into the earliest days of the space shuttle. But very soon after the space shuttle launched, we got this version here, which we call the EMU, the Extravehicular Mobility Unit, which in some ways was very new, but in some ways was very much just an updated Apollo suit. And that's actually what's still in service today, or at least a variant of it. Although in recent years there's been rumblings about finally replacing it. So yeah, we're going to go really from the very beginning, and these 4 kind of show off, notwithstanding some of the sub-variants. And we'll look at these kind of statues and figures. They're fun. They're inexpensive. I just kind of wanted a set. It's pretty easy to find Apollo figures or statues or toys. You can also find Space Shuttle. It's harder to find Mercury. But as always, poor Gemini. It's almost impossible to find the Gemini figure. So I was actually happy to buy both the 4 and the 5 inch in that. So, with that, let's go back to 1958, when Elvis was still alive. The Mark IV high-altitude pressure suit, or vacuum suit. And we'll begin with the 2 figures. This is the taller one. Obviously, he's pre-posed. And the smaller one, the more standard, he does have movement for the shoulders and the legs and the knees. And I believe I guess the head wouldn't, because the real one could not. He's the standard, and this was one released later. They are what they are. They're just fun. I can tell you, if I was a kid and I had this, I would have gone apeshit. In fact, I think I mostly just bought these to appease the inner child me. If he learned that adult me ran across astronaut action figures and did not buy them, there would have been anger. Because growing up, I didn't really have many. The G.I. Joe one was out, but that was about it. Anyway, the suit has an interesting history. Started off as a project with the U.S. Navy. The Goodrich Company manufactured this for unpressurized cockpit. In fact, it was used for a number of years from the 50s to the early 70s in jets like the F-4 Phantom, the F-8 Crusader, and the A-5 in the Navy. The first goal of NASA, or at least one of their first goals when they were established in 58, was to pick a spacesuit, pressure suit, for pretty obvious reasons. And they had two main contenders. The suit used in the X-15 high-performance aircraft, or the Mark IV suit used by the Navy. And they picked the Mark IV because it was by far the lightest suit available at the time, only 22 pounds. Now, pressure suits, of course, had been around since before World War II, but they were typically big and bulky. And that's another thing. It was the slimmest and most flexible. So, wasn't perfect. In fact, inability to move a lot was one of the chief complaints of the astronauts, but for the day and time, it was quite advanced. So that's what they picked. But of course, they had to customize it to turn it into the Mercury suit. For one, the original suit had a kind of a dark gray, muted nylon outer covering. They kept the nylon, but they added kind of an aluminum blend threading. That was for thermal resistance and, temperature regulation. They also changed the helmet. They actually changed the air system quite a bit. With the military version, the head on a lot of the pressure suits is kind of sealed off with the air just going there in the body. This had a full circulation of going into the waist, air going around and out. They obviously had to change things like the faceplate, where they could activate it using facial muscles. And they changed the gloves a number of times, namely giving them one stiff middle finger so they could punch buttons even when fully inflated because, space. And otherwise, they gave them better articulated fingers so they could grab and push things. The boots, too, went through several changes. The Navy boots were just kind of black leather boots. The NASA people first tried kind of a white leather boot. Then they went to kind of the same aluminum coating on the boots. And then finally, at the end, they actually kind of went to boots that were made as part of the suit. So, a number of changes. Of course, they were learning. And you notice there's no backpack, or really much in the way of hoses or anything else. That's because all the life support was actually provided by the craft or a little portable kind of tank kit you sometimes saw the astronauts carrying on the way to the capsules. There's our other guy. Because basically this was an intra-vehicular suit, pressure suit. In fact, it was only inflated for launch and re-entry. Otherwise, they would usually open the faceplate, which would let the seal out. Now, the idea was, in case of a capsule losing integrity, the faceplate would come down, and then hoses connected to the spacecraft would provide oxygen directly to the suit. Thankfully for them, it never happened in flight, so it was basically a backup suit, because the cabin itself was pressurized. So not much moving around. Done. This was Al Shepard's first spacesuit on MR3. As is famously known, it did not have a urine collector. That needed to be incorporated for MR4 Gus Grissom's, which was still a short suborbital redstone flight, but after MR3, well, they learned. They could have just said, hey, don't drink coffee beforehand too, but, hey. Then, though, when we get to the full orbital flights, starting with Glenn, we need a more advanced suit, a more capable suit. Also, they added kind of a life preserver backup after Gus Grissom's interesting landing. So, moving forward into the Mercury Atlas flights, things were done to try to give better mobility, better comfort, better heat regulation, because that was one of those complaints. So they continued to modify it and improve the design. They made the faceplate a little better to actuate. They gave little ways to obviously eat and drink easier, since some of these missions were over a day in orbit, what have you. But it was never 100% comfortable, and it was just kind of it was a good first attempt. Now, each astronaut had 3 suits, and they were all custom tailored for them. 1 suit is for training, practice. 1 suit was for flight, and as you would expect, 1 suit was for a backup. And of course, they had an undergarment, which is, I believe, just basically wool. And it was a good first attempt, but it was never really called upon. And it didn't really have to do anything too strenuous like EVAs. It would also be the only time, or the last time, that the Goodrich Company would be called upon to make a space outfit. Although they would continue to supply these to the U.S. Navy, like I said, through the Vietnam era, the 70s. It's very iconic. I kind of wish he either had the faceplate down or moving, but to be fair, when you see images of the astronauts, they usually did have it up in flight for pretty obvious reasons. Now, this did briefly carry over after the end of Mercury in '63 to the beginning of Gemini, but was quickly abandoned before any manned flights began in that program. So now let's skip over to the G4C. Oops, I forgot the most important improvement. Later versions of the Mercury spacesuit used an oral thermometer. They were very much considered and very aware of biomedical data. Why was a thermometer in your mouth an improvement? Because before, it was a rectal thermometer for the first few missions. Let's move on. The Gemini suits. And again, here. And would it shock you to learn these are the least common ones in the Space Voyagers series? In fact, this one took me a long time to find and package, and it was actually temporarily lost in the mail. It came while I was out of town. So back to the Mercury. Like I said, they picked the Mark IV suit over the X-15, which was manufactured by the David Clark Company. But with Gemini and its expanded mission profile parameters, longer duration, and the need for EVA, and the fact that the Gemini capsule was larger and could hold more in terms of weight, after reevaluating, now NASA selected a version of the X-15 high-altitude suit, of course heavily modified for their needs. And the first variant that the Clark Company manufactured was known as the G4C. This was first and only used on the first Gemini flight, number 3, which was Gus Grissom amongst others. And it was quite a bit lighter than previous versions, about 23 to 24 pounds overall, and really just built upon what was learned with Mercury. It did have additional insulation and other methods of climate control. It went to a white outer layer instead of the silver. It retained removable boots, and they did the best they could for mobility. But again, this version, the G4C, only flew on the very first mission, which was a relatively brief mission. Although it would go on to inspire further vacuum suits and high-altitude suits used by the Air Force and others, in, like, say, the U-2 and the SR-71 and other high-performance aircraft. But that, of course, would directly lead to the G4C suit, the workhorse of Gemini. So here we have it here, and this guy's in a bit of an interesting pose because of doing the whole spacewalk thing, which was always the goal of the program. Now, because the way the space capsule worked, it would actually just be depressurized, the hatches open, meaning both the commander and the pilot would need a spacesuit that could handle vacuum, even if only the pilot would actually be going out into space. The commanders still being exposed to space. So the G4C had additional insulation. It could actually withstand a wide range of temperatures from 250 below to 250 above zero, because, sunlight or shadow. And it had additional features to keep it from ballooning up, something that the Russians learned about the hard way, including keeping mobility in the gloves. So the pilots and the commander suits were nearly identical, except for a couple of things. On the pilot suit, on the one that was actually going to go outside, the boots were made as part of the suit. They weren't detachable. On the commanders, they were. The wrists on both had better articulation, better swiveling. Another thing was the helmet. With the EVA version, you could clip on a sun visor. Pretty obvious why that's important. But otherwise, they were pretty well the same. Now you notice this guy's not wearing a backpack either. That's because he was not only tethered to the spacecraft, he received his oxygen and carbon filtration from it as well. Now the first walk used what was called the Ventilator Control Module, VCM. It was relatively light. It only bumped the suit's weight up to about 34 pounds. Of course, we're talking Earth pounds. But it had limitations. So for subsequent EVAs and later Gemini missions, you had the the phone is ringing. The ELSS, the Extravehicular Life Support System. This was more purpose-built and more flexible for longer missions. It did make it weigh more, up to 43 pounds. It did also have an emergency 1-hour oxygen supply on board the suit, although thankfully for the astronauts, that was never called upon, never needed. But it was there just in case. Some other fun changes were made as well to it to facilitate various exercises, like the EMU, the Astronaut Mobility Unit, which was going to be tried on Gemini 9 and also 12, but never was. It was an early propulsion system. That said, they did have like a little gas gun they did use. So, yeah, pretty neat suit, and I think this configuration, this kind of mid-level NASA astronaut, it's just kind of fascinating. And here's the little guy. It's kind of funny. His arms are pre-posed in that spacewalk, but then his legs are just kind of straight. He's neat. Too bad I don't have a capsule to put him in. That would have been neat if they made that. Oh well. So there was one more major suit variant. That would be the G5C. That was only flown on Gemini 7. And it was considered to be a lightweight version because that was to be a 14-day mission. Hey, if it had been done in the 21st century, it would have been turned into a reality show. Can you imagine being stuffed into a small car orbiting the Earth for 14 days with another person? But this suit was actually quite impressive. It was by far the lightest at only 16 pounds. They got away with it by having a zippered hood instead of a hard hat type helmet, although they did have just basic crash helmets under that. They also had this more zippers on the suit entirely, because the idea was it would be able to be taken off in space. They were kind of testing out if astronauts could endure wearing a suit for the whole voyage to the moon, or if they needed what they considered a shirt sleeve environment, and to no one's surprise, yeah, shirt sleeve. So with that mission, one of the things they did on those 14 days was take their spacesuits off, which, considering the cramped cabin and the bulkiness of the suit, probably took them about 2 days to do in and of itself. But hey, you got to do something, right? I think they only had a couple of books to read they did take with them. They also spent Christmas up there on that mission. But yeah, the lightweight suit was only used for one mission. It was pretty specialized. It would actually, in some senses, inspire later pressure suits used for launches, for example, some of the stuff that the Soviets used. But it's just basically a lightweight emergency suit. They weren't doing an EVA on that mission, so it didn't really need to do that. I think the G5C is pretty neat for what it is. So those are the major variants, and they would fly through all the Gemini missions, and it would actually lead into the Apollo. As I said a minute ago, the original A1C was a derivative of the G3 series here. But of course, after Gus Grissom himself and White himself and a rookie Chaffee lost their lives in a very horrific way with Apollo 1, that caused the whole program to get revamped, including the suit. And that gets us to the A7L, quite possibly the most famous spacesuit in history. Work on what was known as the moon suit at the time began as early as March of 1962. And it was heavily, competed. It was heavily criticized. It was heavily analyzed because this suit had to do a lot. Not just EVAs floating outside the capsule like Gemini, not just walking on the moon. It had to do it all and had to work within the vessel like Mercury before. This is a long voyage. Yeah. And lots of companies vied for this because it was a big, juicy contract. And for the first time, it would also have a life support system, a backpack, which was a major part as well. And there's a lot of back and forth and plans and changing plans. And even by 65, 66 during Gemini, there's not a clear winner and program going. So that's actually how the A1C came to be. The David Clark Company made a modified G4C for the first so-called Block 1 Apollo missions. Talked about the Block 1 capsule. That's the one that caught fire. There were going to be 2 crewed Block 1 flights. But already by December of 66, the second one was canceled. Unfortunately, the first one, Apollo 1, was to go ahead. It was to launch February 21st, 1967. But on January 27th, there was the fire. And the A1C suit was essentially these. It just had a few extra connections and a little bit of reworking to the helmet and the visor, things like that. But what wasn't changed was the outer nylon coating, which was not, fire retardant. It wasn't anti-flammable. And that's unfortunately what melted through. And that very quickly saw this suit retired before it even ever got into space. Just a shame that it came at the cost of lives. But from NASA's perspective, the Block 1 flight was not to have an EVA or anything like that. It was just to stay inside the capsule flight. The G3/4/5 worked fine for the Gemini missions. So why not? It was a proven design, they thought. But, the Block 1 Apollo capsule was a new thing, and it just didn't work out. So that just put more pressure to make the next suit the much better, including being fire retardant. So now we talk about the A7L and its derivatives, which, to be fair, after a rocky start, ended up being very dependable and used for the better part of 2 decades. How to simplify the first 2-3 years of moon suit development. It was a clusterfuck. There were lots of partnerships and ideas and abandonments. In fact, there was a forced partnership between Hamilton and International Latex Company, ILC. It's a forced partnership. It didn't work out. Goodrich was brought in again, whatever. By the end of 64, NASA decided, you know what? Well, yeah, we'll do this system. We're going to do Block 1, 2, 3 for the suits. Block 1 can be the David Clark Gemini suit modified, the A1C. Block 2 is the first moon suit. It needs to be able to walk on the moon for a couple hours. Block 3, it'll be the extended duration suit. So they picked Block 1 right then. Okay, we're going to go with that. Block 2, they wanted to make the Hamilton ILC thing work out, but by 65 it was clear it wasn't happening. So partnership changes, trials again. Block 3, we'll figure that out later, was pretty much what they thought. Either way, there's another round of trials in June of 65, and ILC's newest design, known as the A7L, is the winner. This is a problem because they're not the backpack maker, or the EMU, Extravehicular Mobility Unit. This is sometimes called the PSA, Pressure Suit Assembly, the suit itself. So NASA kind of takes over primary development and, contracting out for the backpack. Of course, there's tons of subcontractors. This is a major thing. So by 65, they're kind of picking companies, and by 66, they finally have it basically laid out. And this is a one-piece suit. It's a rear access. One thing that's new is they went to a type of helmet that clamps onto a ring, twist onto a ring as opposed to previous versions. Same goes for the gloves. We've got all kinds of connectors and whatnot. And there's going to be variations of this suit because you need one for the guys going to the moon, you need one for the command modular pilot, and you need ones for takeoff, re-entry, yada yada. It's a whole system because of the profile. As a result, weight went up. Now the A7L was first. In 1966 we get the A7L, which has an outer layer added as a kind of a micro meteoroid shield, abrasion guard because, moon dust is rough. But then of course the Apollo fire happens and we get the A7L in 1967, which switches from a nylon type outer coating to one made of what was called beta cloth, fire retardant. It's also worth pointing out that a lot of rubber was used in the joints and seals because they needed better mobility than ever before, especially for walking. It's also worth pointing out that today this is why there's basically no A7L suits still in working order because, rubber deteriorates. These were not meant to be long-term, long-use things. They were meant to fulfill one mission. Just as before with Mercury and Gemini, suits are custom tailored to the wearers. They're used for one mission and then they're retired. Just thought I'd point that out because it is relevant. So, because of the Apollo fire, things get delayed. Production happens. The first time the new A7L flies is with Apollo 7, October 1968, but it's not the complete suit. That would actually wait until March of 69 with, did I say? Yeah, I said 7, right? Apollo 7, not 8. Either way, Apollo 9 would have the full suit, and it would be actually the A7L's first EVA. Of course, we're in the Earth orbit, not lunar orbit. And then Apollo 10 actually would not have an EVA, although the A7L would still be on board. So the complete moon outfit with full connections had the undergarment that circulated water for cooling into the backpack air. The whole thing was about 75 pounds. Now, the one worn by the command module pilot was much simpler, far fewer layers. It had just a cotton undergarment called the constant wear garment. No backpack, simplified hoses, connections. It still weighed over 60 pounds. Because, lots of layers, lots of things. And we're trying to standardize as best we can. But, the CM pilot had a much simplified version because on these early missions, he wasn't expected to need to do an EVA. It was just basically for launch, re-entry, that kind of thing. So those were the early tests. They were made by ILC, at least the primary suit was, with the EMU kind of contracted out by NASA. It had 6 hours of life support, oxygen, cooling, other necessary things, filtrations. It also had a 30-minute backup, which was kind of pioneered on the later ELSs used by the Gemini crews. But in most ways, it was a whole new design. It was a whole new company. In fact, that was one of the problems early on NASA had with ILC was, even though they knew latex, they didn't really know spacesuits. So NASA was reluctant. But after the A1C fiasco, they were a little more receptive. And it ended up being quite a good contract, so much so that ILC spun off a subdivision just to make spacesuits in 1969, known as ILC Dover. And they would continue making all the Apollo suits thereforth. But remember that whole Block 3 thing? That's for, of course, the extended duration J-type missions. Whatever happened to that? You've seen the two that Space Voyagers Action Products made for Mercury and Gemini. For Apollo, they made quite a few more. Here's that smaller scale again. He's in a standard suit. But they made others. And this one is kind of interesting that they made. It's kind of in between product lines. It does have basic arm movement up and down and for the legs, but no bending. And it does have a removable backpack, but no removable hoses. But he's actually interesting because he is wearing an A7LB suit. And I didn't actually mean to buy him. I meant to buy a different one, and we'll look at it in just a minute. But I'm actually glad I did. Again, these are very inexpensive, so no big deal. Like I said, Block 3 was to be the long duration, at least 7 hours. But by 66, NASA realized they didn't need a whole Block 3 suit. They could actually just take the Block 2 suit and make an updated EMU for it. And kind of responding to this, International Latex proposed what they called the A9L. Well, for whatever reason, NASA renamed that to the A7LB. I have a feeling it had to do with budgetary reasons, because at this point, post-Apollo 11, they're starting to get a little bit of a crunch from Congress and what have you. So I would imagine calling it a B made it seem like just a variant for another suit versus a whole new suit. Either way, it was for the extended J missions, which, as you remember, were Apollos 15, 16, and 17. I should point out, kind of going back to the rover, beginning on 13 and running through 14, red markings were applied so that you could tell who was who. But what this really did, it gave them more time on the moon, up to 8 hours plus 30 minutes emergency. And that's not just air. That's filtration systems like the lithium hydroxide. It's water for the circulation system, and energy and power for this suit, so batteries. All this extra stuff meant that the backpack had to be reworked, and so the way to tell, and NASA didn't like this, but for the extended backpack, there's a bit of a bulge on the side for the extra stuff, something that NASA only reluctantly accepted. They also had to move the hoses up a bit from the original style of connection. That was to give some waist articulation, waist joint movement, and that was for sitting in the lunar rover vehicle. They improved articulation elsewhere a bit more too. Now you notice here there's this kind of thing in the front. It's not here. That's actually a reservoir for drinking water. And as I've alluded to earlier, they actually had a little snack built into the helmet too. Little energy bar. Early 70 energy bars. Tasty. But no, that's so they could operate on the moon for well over 6 hours. Some of the missions were well over 7, really pushing it by the time of Apollo 17. And on top of that, they were expected to make 3 spacewalks, 3 moonwalks, I should say, with each suit, so they had to be durable. And so with all this extra stuff, this was over 78 pounds. Now, the command module pilot, again, budget cuts, wasn't given his own suit model. He had a modified A7LB, a little bit lighter weight though, about 65 pounds. And he wasn't now expected to do a spacewalk in EVA. That was to retrieve the film canisters that were in the service module, something new. So he did have to have more connections for air, but he would not use a backpack. He had an umbilical towards the space, connected to the spacecraft. Although he did have a 30-minute oxygen supply, just in case, on board. He would go out, do his thing, and the lunar module pilot would kind of stand up in the hatch in his full suit, just there to help him and, hand the stuff off. So it was a more complicated suit, although the air and the cooling wasn't on board. Again, these have water circulation as an undergarment thing. But, so there is kind of an interim cut down LB type suit. And that was the extended mission suit, the Block 2 extended versus going to, in total, Block 3. But even after Apollo 17, the A7L service is not over yet. So when I said I was actually looking for something else when I got this guy, it's because I was looking for one of these guys. And all my stuff I picked up new except this one, because I haven't found the new one package. But this is their highly articulated 5-inch series, which when these were introduced around 2000, 2001, they had moving feet. They had knees, crotch, of course, elbows, arms. I think they've got 15 points. Removable helmet, removable backpack. Kind of neat. Just want to find a new one day, but for now, used is okay. But yeah, he's in the early Apollo suit with the connections. And even the opening up little sun visor here. So next, the suit would be called upon for the Skylab missions, the 3 of those. And the Skylab version of the A7LB would be somewhat simplified, because we're not walking on the moon now, we're doing spacewalks. And it would have an umbilical again to the station for air, although it would again have a 30-minute emergency supply of oxygen just in case. So no backpack, and it got rid of some of the stuff. And things were done to kind of improve articulation with the hands, the gloves, because they were doing repairs. That was the main thing for the Skylab stuff. And so those suits were made, and they were just modified A7LBs yet again for 6 more astronauts. And right as it looks like Apollo's time is ending, the A7L's time is ending, in 1975, we get the very interesting Apollo-Soyuz project. For this final mission, the A7LB was called upon again, but it was simplified to be more comfortable, lighter weight, and more economical. At this point, money's run out. In fact, the whole program existed because of leftovers, including the Apollo 18 capsule. So this suit, since there was not to be an EVA, they didn't really have the gear for that. They didn't have, for example, EVA gloves on board. And the suit was basically just there for launch and re-entry, pressure suit stuff. So the program kind of ended where it began, just as an emergency life support, going all the way back to Mercury. Nevertheless, these were still complicated and still weighed 60 pounds with all the gear, but were technically the final variants, and in some ways they were improved. They'd been making these for a while, so they kind of got the handle on what did and didn't work with the ASP, or in Russia, as it was known, the SAP program. But those had been more just the intervehicular version with the always wear garment and stuff. It'd be kind of neat to have an Apollo astronaut that had that. But yeah, these are neat. The little one kind of scales with my cat. Well, sorry, not this, the little one. But even he's nice because he goes with the lunar rover. This one's nice for just being kind of a brick. This one's a surprise, but kind of cool. I wanted a B version. And this one's neat, but I sure would like to find a brand new and packaged one. So if anyone sees one of these, let me know. But we're not quite done yet. In fact, in some ways, we're just kind of beginning as we enter the 80s and the space shuttle. The spacesuit, designed for and used on the space shuttle for pretty much all of the space shuttle's years, was the Extravehicular Mobility Unit, EMU. And yeah, it is extremely similar to the A7L, A7LB, even still being made by IALC and Hamilton, making the, basically one made the soft parts, one made the hard. Kind of funny because they were both competitors in 64, 65, but after NASA kind of took over the project by 1974, when this began, they were good partners, which 10 years before did not work out so hot. But yeah, that's when NASA first kind of released the contract for this, and so development on the new spacesuit started in 75, and it was more or less finalized by 1980, and then went through testing, and the first suits were delivered to NASA in 1982, so a year after the shuttle program literally got off the ground. Now, on STS-4, they practiced with the spacesuit, so early on. That was in 1982. Now, they were going to try it on STS-5, but there was an electrical issue, so it had to be postponed until STS-6. That was the first test in early 1983. And yeah, again, these look very similar to the Apollos, but there are some differences. We'll start off with our little guy this time. Like Apollo, this had a true backpack, and like the LB variant, it had up to 8 hours of standard life support and another 30 minutes of provisional emergency support. And the idea was obviously EVAs, satellite maintenance, construction maintenance, basically on-orbit work off the shuttle. So we're not having to walk on the moon. So you're essentially in zero-G, microgravity as it's called. And this allowed for the suit to be heavier. It's over 100 pounds. And a lot of that additional weight comes from the torso, which is now more of a hard shell, with really only the legs and arms being still soft. And we have more going on in the backpack. More electricity, more connections, more computerized systems, what have you. And there was one other major difference. Well, at the original Apollo, you had a catheter. With this, now you get to wear a space diaper. But being serious, part of that was, one, they were planning for many long duration spacewalks, 6-7 hours. So, call of nature. For another, there were plans to have women in space and doing EVAs. And yeah, speaking of, these suits, while they were customized, where they were fitted and they were kind of sized, small, medium, large, for their wearers, they weren't especially made for individual people. And also, for the first time, they were meant to be reusable. In fact, 18 suits were made, and we're still using about 10 of them today, at least as of last year. Of course, they've been refurbished, refitted, and all that stuff. But kind of goes to show you. Now, typically, a space shuttle would carry at least 2 of these suits with spare parts, maintenance parts. But on some missions, for example, servicing the Hubble, they would carry 4, and they would usually operate in pairs of 2. So on some missions, you had 4 people performing spacewalks at the same time. Quite interesting. And they would really take off after initial testing in 1983. By 84, they were in routine use, servicing satellites, and proved to be quite dependable. Again, though, they're specialized for basically floating around or working in a cargo bay, not walking on the moon, so a little bit different. Now, in the beginning, these were tethered to the spaceship as before, but they had more ambitions. And in fact, this look was everywhere when I was a kid in the 80s. An astronaut piloting the EMU, Manned Maneuvering Unit, essentially a small spacecraft. As much as this was publicized, and as long as it was in development, it actually was only used for a year. And it actually dates back to 1966 in the Gemini program, when the AMU was flown but never actually tested in orbit. And then it wasn't needed later on for the moon landings. But with the shuttle and its cargo ability and construction abilities, this was quickly revisited and 2 units were manufactured. And they were put on board STS, I believe it was 41B, in February of 84, just for a test. And after that was successful, in April, STS 41C attempted using these, because typically the shuttle would have 2, to capture 2 satellites. They had gone off course. No, sorry, 1 satellite on that mission. And it didn't work. In fact, the astronaut trying to grab hold, it made the situation worse, and they nearly lost the satellite. Luckily, the shuttle's robot arm, thanks Canada, it's kind of saved the day then. Now, they did try it again, but it was on STS 51A in November, still in 1984, and that time they were actually able to capture 2 satellites and bring them into the cargo bay. So 1 good test, 1 basically failure, and 1 success. And this figure here is again one of the more articulated versions in the 5-inch. He actually came with quite a bit. He came with a couple of tools, and he came with the standard pack. In the real world, the life support pack actually fit behind. This kind of fit in. They would basically keep these in the cargo bay, and once they're already suited up and in vacuum, slot themselves in. The arms folded for storage, and then they would grab them and pull them out. And that's how you controlled it. Each stick did its own things, like yaw, pitch, and roll was on the left. And it used nitrogen gas to propel itself around. And the point here was, these were not tethered to the spacecraft. They were powered and independent. And they had enough propulsion on board to do about a 6-hour EVA. Now, of course, that's not 6 hours of constant movement. That's just an average, an estimation. But they had some pretty advanced computer systems for what they were. And this wasn't an especially heavy critter. About 400 pounds, 350. So a neat idea. Really was. But after Challenger, it's kind of interesting to me that they didn't try deploying these again in 85. But after the Challenger accident in January of 86, the whole space program was reevaluated, and this was considered just a totally unnecessary risk. You've got guys out there not tethered. And if someone were to go off course with one of these, how are you going to rescue him, especially if they're moving at velocity? I mean, these things weren't super duper fast, but they could travel dozens of feet per second acceleration, and you're in space, so if it went to full blast for a while, it could get up to some speed. So they evaluated what these could and couldn't do and decided, you know what? The arm on the shuttle can actually do a lot of this work, and what it can't do, a traditional tethered spacewalk can do. So we're just not going to risk our astronauts. This was kind of one of those things that NASA had wanted to do for decades, and they did, but, you know, reality versus fiction of it. But this is a neat figure, I think. Kind of G.I. Joe size. I actually had a G.I. Joe in the 80s, payload bay, that came with the G.I. Joe version of this. Even came with a stiff wire. You could kind of suspend him like he is floating. So yeah, the two units were retired and actually in museums now, but they did actually lead to a more compact version called Safer. That was trialed in 1994 and has been in use since 1998. But that's just an emergency system to take the astronaut back if they do get knocked off, go off course. So this did kind of evolve, but only in an emergency system, not in routine use. They did consider reactivating or building new versions of this in 1997 when plans to build the International Space Station on orbit were, being finalized. But in the end, they decided again, we can do this with tethered walks and the other abilities. We just don't want to risk it. So these never did come out of retirement. And that's really a good segue to talk about the modernized EMU. Here's another one of the more articulated members in the Space Voyagers 5-inch fleet. This was marketed as the International Space Station EVA scientist, although I actually gave him the torqueless wrench that came on the previous one just because the other one's got his hands full with the EMU. Now this one actually came with a couple of robots from the International Space Station, which good thing to get out for this video, because we'll do a video talking about the International Space Station itself soon. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about this. The enhanced EMU was introduced in 1998 specifically for work on the International Space Station, although it would also, of course, fly with the shuttle. In fact, the standard EMU last flew in 2002. After that time, all the suits had updated to the enhanced standard, which was, generally speaking, just a modernization of comms gear, computer systems, safety equipment. These all had Safer built in now. They also had extended life batteries. They still were good for 8 hours. Basically designed for longer duration work missions. In fact, they even were given heating elements in the gloves, so they could work even on the night side of Earth during that transit. But in other ways, it's still kind of the same suit we've had since Apollo. The so-called Snoopy cap still underneath. We still kind of have the bubble helmet. By the way, these do have flip-up visors. When I said that, now I get the one that sticks. There we go. Kind of neat. So flip it up for night use or down during the day. Unlike with the Apollo, I've actually picked these two up new, so they tend to be a little stiff since they've been sitting in a package since 2002 or 3. Kind of neat. So yeah, the other things, these are designed to be more modular and adaptable so that they could be resized on orbit, so up on the space station, instead of having to go back to Earth. Because the idea, the station would carry 2 at all times, and different astronauts are coming and going that need to be fitted for them. These are meant to be left at least 2 years on the station, although the manufacturer, which is, Hamilton and ILC still, says maybe up to 6 years before they need to come back all the way to Earth for a total service overhaul. And, of course, these are back to being tethered in flight. And are still the suits on the station today. Just an enhanced and literally safer version. And here's the third member in the little family of EMU suits. Kind of to celebrate women operating in space. That's what we've got here. Female member. I believe the first female doing an American spacewalk was on STS-41G. Also, this figure has kind of a funny gimmick. The power of magnets. Although, it only goes so far when you're hanging literally upside down. But it will stick to other metal things because it's actually in the feet. What if it'll stick to my light? Yes. Yes, it does. So, yeah, it's got magnets in the feet. And then, of course, this is a metal base. Just thought I'd bring it out. Kind of wish she came with some tools. But I guess I felt like that was enough for a inexpensive action figure. These are like $10. So, take it as is. I just wanted to bring that out for a minute. And mention, give credit where credit's due. On June 1st, 2022, NASA did announce that the EMU would be replaced finally, be retired. But that's going to take a long time because, of course, it would. This whole thing, well, you can really see the design lineage from the very beginning. Going all the way back here, we had the original Mark IV pressure suit, modified into an intra-vehicular suit. Then, of course, the X-15 became modified as the G4C, the first EVA suit. And after some tough lessons, we ended up with the A7L and the much more extended A7LB, which really did accomplish some remarkable things on the moon. So much so that the next 2 generations were directly influenced by it. The way of getting in, the helmet, a lot of that didn't change. Of course, a lot of the technology inside did. Computers, circuitry, that would improve and be miniaturized. I should say that the newest ones, though, are quite heavy, at over 120 pounds base, and some of the ones used on the space station with all their equipment are even heavier. Far cry from the original 22-pound suit, but then again, it was essentially an inflatable balloon that was only held down by some elastic cords, so, a little more advancement. But yeah, these are pretty much all the space suits worn, aside from like flight suits, by Americans and also American allies who traveled into space. Of course, that's not getting into the Russian stuff. The Orland space suit is sort of very much on use on the International Space Station as well. But I don't have figures of those. I wish I did. Maybe one day. But wanted to share this with you and talk about it. What do you think? This is Misha. We'll catch you very soon. Next time.